first question is, in your view, what are the major challenges the world economy is currently facing?
Well, I think the main problem is what you see behind me as chairman of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. This constitutes a kind of picture of the need for interconnection that is the basis for both cooperation and friendship in terms of economic development. And the only way that economic development proceeds effectively is with the essential development of modern infrastructure. That means that there are, of course, questions around the value of raw materials, which have historically been in the picture. But the true ability to address the major challenges which we have right now are embodied in the initiative of the Belt and Road as a vehicle for eliminating poverty through the fundamental basis of infrastructure development. And that deals with a more essential question, which I won't touch on at the moment, but perhaps a bit later in this interview, which is the question of physical economy. Because infrastructure is dependent on having an actual economic foundation in infrastructure through physical economic development. So I think that is what the directionality of the Belt and Road has been. As you probably know, there's more than 150 countries that have joined the Belt and Road initiative in the form of memorandums of understanding, and it is obviously totally voluntary. The countries that choose to do it decide to do it, and the collaboration that occurs, for example, between China and these individual nations that are part of the Belt and Road development perspective, they choose to engage in it voluntarily. And China does not attempt to make conditionalities about internal policies in those countries, but simply based on the idea of developing these kinds of modern infrastructure, which obviously includes modern transport, modern water facilities, electrification. These are the basis in which you eliminate poverty. And the connectivity of the world in terms of what the objective of the Belt and Road is, I think, is kind of solution that will address the challenges we do have in the world economy.
But there is an obvious question: how does this approach differ from the Western approach to global development? Because Western countries also build infrastructure, they also build a lot of different facilities in other countries. What is the main difference between BRI and the standard Western approach?
Well, the Western approach, one has to look at it in two ways. One is historically, there has been times when Western industrialization was and has been quite effective, at least internally, in terms of U.S. Commitment to a concept called the American system of political economy, which was defined by the founder, Alexander Hamilton. But these are not the policies that are dominating neither the United States nor Western Europe. Since the end of the Second World War, that means that we have basically been operating also essentially since the end of the Bretton Woods system, when the American president, Richard Nixon, removed the dollar from a fixed exchange rate. And since then, you have had a floating, so-called dollar-based system, which is not focused in any way primarily on the development of infrastructure. So it's a mistaken view that Western economies have, at the moment, an orientation for infrastructure development. They do not. They have a massive speculation, refinancing of debt, rather than major infrastructure investments, which has historically been something that the West could do and hopefully will restart again. But at the moment, under the present international agreements with the IMF, the World Bank, as well as the payment system of the dollar, which is being used politically, as you know, in terms of the situation with Russia, to sanction not only Russia, but countries which the United States primarily, with its NATO allies, decides that they don't like what is going on. And they have these objectives which politically prevent precisely the type of cooperation and development which, for example, China has been doing. And you see the results in which recently China negotiated, to help negotiate, diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who have not been political allies, but on the basis of understanding how one can cooperate for the general benefit of individual nation states' economic development. That's how you define minimally initial cooperation, and hopefully it can evolve into friendship.
And so, how the world may look if all the BRI initiatives are fully implemented, if the BRI really flourishes more than it flourishes now, what the world may look like, why BRI has certain appeal for the future, for example.
Well, look at the map behind me, and you see an idea that would more or less interconnect all the corridors of the continents of the world. That is the potential. This was initially put forward by work of the Schiller Institute, which was defined as the Eurasian land bridge. But this has been adopted in their own way by President Xi Jinping with the initiative of the Belt and Road. And this, as I said, is built on the idea of corridors, modern infrastructure, which it's not only the transport corridors themselves, it's actually around the transport corridors that you develop cities, you develop modern capabilities, which are then subsidized or part of a trade basis, which supplies goods, services, infrastructure, capital goods that are necessary for modernization and development. But this goes back to the 1800s, when the actual idea was brought out in the United States by the Lincoln administration for what was then the Transcontinental Railroad. And that was understood that the landmass of the United States would be uplifted economically by having this kind of transport corridor through the so-called underdeveloped portions of the nation. That became the policy of the Russian minister Sergei Witte with the Trans-Siberian Railroad. these kinds of initiatives have been, unfortunately, not fully implemented before, but I think the world is moving very rapidly into a recognition, especially the agreements that have come between Russia and China. These types of agreements are defining a new perspective for global development that is coming from the East at the moment. It is coming from the Asian continents, the developing nations in Africa, in South America. And hopefully, at the moment, it is not the case, but hopefully in the future, there will be a situation where the Western countries in Europe and the United States will come to their senses and begin to cooperate with this. At the moment, that's not the case, unfortunately.
And so if we try to move a bit from the global picture to Europe, there is a very common idea among Russian experts that Europe was, in a way, left out of the current wave of globalization, especially since Europe, in part, didn't fully recover from the economic crisis of 2008. And now it's suffering a lot because of the current conflict and because of its economic complications. And so, what is the current European outlook on the Belt and Road Initiative? Maybe does Europe see this project as an opportunity to reinvent itself, to change its economic position in the world?
Well, I think this is on the table right now. You have had the recent visit of the French President Emmanuel Macron to China, and I think it's clear for many European countries that at least trade with China is a crucial part of the future for Europe's economies. In point of fact, it is still in all reality also a crucial part of European trade, as we know with Russia as well. But the problem is the geopolitics, the problem of dividing the world into blocks that are defined by Western powers in who will submit and follow their so-called rules and ideas, which are not necessarily interpreted or seen in any way by the rest of the world, but they are still in attempting to insist that the world has to follow their example and impose it. Europe has clearly suffered on the economic front because of these imposed sanctions. They're not doing a thing to actually change the circumstances. It doesn't solve the problem, but it has made the economic conditions in Europe considerably worse. And the question now is, there is, I think, an awakening. You also had the visit, of course, of Olaf Scholz to China. Germany and France being the so-called largest European economies, they are both clearly recognizing the importance of trade with China. And this obviously implies the land routes that are part of the Belt and Road projects. Because if you're going to have successful trade beyond just maritime trade, which is the cheapest, but it is also takes a very long time. It's not particularly quick. These kinds of effective transport corridors, and I think most people know that China in the last not even 20 years has built approximately 40,000 kilometers of the most modern train systems in the world. And if those kinds of train systems are cutting across the Eurasian continent, then we're talking about trade and development that would not only be beneficial with China, but it would include a good deal of the Eurasian economic agreements that include Kazakhstan and the other Central European nations. And obviously, the commitment that China made to develop the Belt and Road very successfully in Belarus with the idea of the Great Stone Industrial Park, which is a model of development and cooperation. But again, these corridors do function, but they have unfortunately been affected naturally. And the situation in Ukraine, which could clearly, if this conflict was ended, which it should be, as quickly as possible for everyone involved, it would basically mean a opening of those types of corridors. So yeah, the question of Europe's future is directly linked to this kind of cooperation. And unfortunately, the general political view of the European nation governments has not been favorable to the Belt and Road, but they at least have understood trade with China is of value. Hopefully, they will also begin to understand the importance of the Belt and Road to join that and to participate in alleviating global poverty, as I mentioned in the beginning.
And so, if we move a bit to the east, what is the role of the Eurasian Economic Union and, in general, of Eurasia in the BRI? Because it may seem like Eurasian Union, being a mainly economic bloc around Russia, may come into some kind of conflict with the BRI, because those are two partly competing projects. Is it a true competition, or the BRI can include a lot of different economic blocks within it?
Yeah, I don't think that. I think both because of the recent agreements between President Xi Jinping and President Putin, that there is clearly a foundation for cooperation as opposed to some kind of unfriendly competition. Now, obviously, the Eurasian Economic Union has a certain perspective, which up until now was mostly defined by Russian, Kazakhstan, I think the other country,
Armenia and Belarus.
Armenia and Belarus, and this obviously also is more of a focus on the northern corridor, which could be definitely, if the world would get out of this divide and rule geopolitical madness, then you also have a perspective for the development of the Arctic region, which is going across the top of Russia, Siberia. This could clearly involve even cooperation with Japan, China. This could be one of the key, and that would directly come into cooperation with Scandinavia, with especially Finland, Sweden, and Norway. So one sees that there is a great potential, and then the Eurasian Economic Commission is actually, I've read recently an article that was issued by the Russian news site, that they are already expanding it to a free trade zone, which includes Vietnam, and I can't remember. I think there is a definite interest from India. So the question of the Eurasian development perspective, although it is not exactly the same as the Belt and Road directly, can clearly be integrated in terms of cooperation. You have in addition, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is also promoting this kind of development in terms of Southwest Asia and in terms of the countries of what has been called the Middle East. We prefer to call it Southwest Asia, and I do, and there are reasons for that. But the point is that these parts of the Eurasian continent, in conjunction with Africa and many other countries that are now interested, define a new global perspective. And it's time for, in my view, humanity to come to its senses and end this kind of war and conflict, and begin to instead meet the challenges for global economic development. So the Eurasian development, I think this is also the case that there is a recent publication by Russian economist Sergei Glassiev, who recently spoke at the Moscow Economic Forum and is actually the minister for the integration and macroeconomics of the Eurasian Economic Commission. And he wrote a new book called, or has written a new book that is now, I think, available, China's Economic Miracle, Lessons for Russia and the World. And there you see that rather than falling into the trap of seeing one nation as even a competitor rather than a cooperative friend, you have the foundation for a highly successful global development perspective into the coming period in world history. So I don't see in any way that these different structures which are developing out of the Asian continent that are rising, also in Southeast Asia. You have the development, as you might know, of the Laos project that was connecting China and Laos with a modern transport train that has again changed the overall. I mean, Laos has been a landlocked country. This means automatically this kind of connectivity that is highly beneficial and has been fully supported by Laos and China together as part of this BRI development. And obviously Vietnam can also participate in these kinds of cooperative development perspectives. So yeah, I think there is a great deal of optimism despite the dangers that are still unfortunately met daily in terms of these ongoing geopolitical conflicts.
Yes, and talking a bit about those dangers, I think that we very often hear rhetoric about BRI being politicized. For example, we can hear Western representatives saying that it's just a Chinese project that has some kind of clear political goals. And my question is whether it is possible to avoid this politicization, or it is an inevitable thing with any kind of successful project that it gets, maybe it's a wrong word, but smeared with some political allegations.
Well, I mean, I addressed, and also the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden has actively, my colleague I work with very closely, who's the vice chairman of the Belt and Road, Hussein Askari. He has written a number of articles which are available on our homepage www.bricsweden.org, and there you can see that he has documented all of this talk about the debt trap is nothing, it has no substance to it. It is a propaganda tool, and it is being used because of the refusal of Western power structures, and primarily the United States, and at least to a great extent their Western European allies, to demonize China, and therefore to identify the BRI as a new form of type of colonial expansion on the part of China. There's no substance to this. This is being used to, for the most part, it's directed against the populations in the West, because they do not have often enough accurate information about what is really going on. But I'll give you one or two basic points on this, this is statistics that come from the United Nations and the United Nations Statistics Division. And they already are, these were done in terms of global manufacturing output in 2019. China has had at that time, these were the top 10 countries, about 28.7% of the global manufacturing. The United States, which was approximately 17%, and Japan and Germany, 7% and approximately 5%, were hardly even combined, reaching the level of manufacturing that is ongoing in China. So in addition, what you have is in China, approximately 30% of the country's total economic output is manufacturing. In the United States, it's approximately 11%. That gives you, and these are coming from UN statistics on GDP. And that gives you a clear picture of what I mean when I say that the United States has abandoned its more traditionally positive role of infrastructure and manufacturing, and has turned away into the direction of pure speculation on money markets, derivatives, and refinancing of currency or currency speculations. These have nothing to do with real physical economy. And China's clearly on a different road. And that is why we see a totally unique development in the world and in world history, which is emerging around China's development as probably already the world's most advanced and developed economy. And I think the fact that Dr. Glassiev has recognized that this is something that could be a very useful perspective for internal improvements and development in Russia, among other nations, shows the direction that is being seen. The United States, on the other hand, offers nothing. I did an interview where I mentioned how Janet Yellen went to Zambia and was telling the Zambians not to deal with China when she arrived at the modern airport that was built by China. So you see the irony that you have these Western leaders who I think they are partly totally incompetent in terms of real economic thinking, but they are also serving an agenda that is not serving or not delivering anything for the developing countries in the world. So why would they not turn to China as an example of how they can make headway to achieving what I think every nation would want to achieve, which is a good standard of living for all of its people and its population.
And so, besides this politicization, what are the main challenges in implementing the BRI, and what are the regions where those BRI initiatives faced the most problems? Because it's such a diverse project trying to unite the entire world economy. So it's obvious that in some places it's going to be going smoother, and in some places it's going to be a bit rougher.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that there is a concept that has been mentioned before, the what I call a community of sovereign nation states, which is, number one, this idea that has followed an initiative of the Belt and Road, which, by the way, is now a 10-year project. It was begun in 2013, and this year is a 10th year anniversary or celebration of its initiative. That you have this idea of, in addition with the Global Development Initiative, which was then launched by Xi Jinping at the United Nations, as well as the Global Security Initiative. Out of that, you have a perspective for respecting sovereignty of nations. Not every nation has exactly the same values or historical ideas that others have. The question of how you can find better ways to address and communicate essentially revolve around, number one, addressing first and foremost the issue of economic development. If you try and address them on the basis first of political differences, you will fail, and it will not work. They will not succeed in imposing their values on others. This tendency of a so-called rules-based order is doomed to failure. So the alternative is a community of sovereign nation states where you respect the sovereignty of other nations, but you work for certain common principles which can be a part of this global development perspective. I will just add that the latest initiative by President Xi Jinping, which I highly am very pleased about, because I've been personally calling for what I identified as the cultural Belt and Road for a couple of years, and he has now launched an initiative called the Global Civilization Initiative, which I think is precisely the direction of how, in combination with economic development, you establish a foundation for communication of ideas. And I mentioned that even in the case of Western development, European development, at the time of one of the individuals who I work and develop most closely in my own educational company, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz was an individual who stood for this kind of perspective among friendship and nations. Sometimes it's important that you look at history in order to gain the insights as to how you overcome the type of inflamed circumstances where it doesn't appear that seems to be any basis for agreement. Leibniz not alone founded the Scientific Academy in Berlin, in Vienna, he was also instrumental in founding the Scientific Academy in St. Petersburg. He didn't live to see it, but his friendship with Tsar Peter the Great, led to the foundation of the Petersburg Academy in 1725. And that's a kind of model for how I think the West could begin to reunite in a proper manner with the developing countries, the Asian economies, with Russia certainly. And I think that's the direction we need to go in order to combine the economic side of development with a cultural understanding that is quite crucial in order to overcome these inflamed invectives, which are not helping to, in my view, resolve anything that is required for the better future for mankind.
Thank you very much. I'm currently out of questions, and I think that you laid out a very interesting and a very compelling view of the world. And we in Russia, and I think in most countries of the world, really hope that at least some elements of it come true. And I'm again very thankful to you for agreeing to have this interview and for your insightful comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to participate, and anything that I can do as chairman of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, which has a obvious view of how we can continue to promote friendship and cooperation, and in any sense that I can further cooperate and work with the Russian International Affairs Council to see that view spread rather than the alternative, I'll be more than happy to continue to cooperate and agree to interviews and maybe other forms of cooperation. So thank you very much for having me.